ago to deal in this conference with the subject, how to understand science for policy making, I was a little surprised. Of course, Chancellor Angela Merkel would be interested, but she seems to be a rather exceptional case among decision makers and aspiring decision makers. Hence, my surprise and a little bit of anxiety. A little bit of anxiety concerning my ability to raise some interest for the subject among you. It is so difficult to build bridges across cultural gaps, and not only between nations. And indeed, the technicalities of modern science are very difficult to grasp for those who have not professionally worked in one of the disciplines. However, as I have experienced at both Sciences Po and Columbia with my students, if you stick to very fundamental subjects in science, very fundamental aspects of science, and very important pedagogically, if you provide flesh to what you say with a well-chosen set of significant, illuminating examples, and if you honestly discuss the significance of these examples in general for assessing scientific method, you can do a good job. In a certain sense, with all kinds of students, including students who had almost no contact with natural sciences, you can, to a certain extent, bridge the cultural gap. And that is important for future public responsibility, because in a large extent, science shapes our lives. Science shapes the destiny of nations, and those who lead the nations should have some intuition about science when they take decisions which include important scientific aspects. So I submit to you my pedagogical experience. And I will test it now with, of course, discussing a few points. And I hope we will raise other points during the discussion. Have you heard of David Beckham? Many people have. Have you heard of Madonna? Even more people have. Have you heard of Charles Towns, Richard Smalley, Herbert Boyer, Stanley Cohen? Don't panic, not many people have. You know how much money you get when you get the Nobel Prize? Well, not bad, but small beer for David Beckham or Madonna. David Beckham fascinates hearts with a ball, and Madonna with songs, and a few other things. For best or worst, but always with far-reaching effects in both space and time, Charles Towns gave birth to the laser in a Columbia lab. Richard Smalley opened the doors to the nano world. Herbert Boyer and Stanley Cohen together laid the cornerstone of genetic engineering. It's a different world. first question I will raise, and later on I want to discuss with you, is why such a paradox between influence on deepest currents of history and obscurity? Well, we should not take obscurity in an extreme sense. One of the most imaginative mathematicians of all times, Évariste Galois, lived and died in no less tragic obscurity than the painter Vincent van Gogh. But nowadays, obscurity is in general more comfortable. And this is an important point, and it has an important meaning in terms of public policy. You don't know with any precision what you will discover or what you will invent. You don't know when, of course, and even you don't know whether you will reach any significant result. So, you are obviously unable to report every 3 months to shareholders or with somewhat longer delays to quotas. And you are unable to perform at set moments like Peking in a football match or like Madonna at a concert. So you need obscurity. It's a protection. It's a protection of the ways science came along and of the necessary independence of scientists. It has a price, not the price that you have not as much money as Madonna and as much glory as Madonna, but the price that this obscurity, necessary obscurity, contributes to the difficulty of communicating between science and society. You have no obvious leaders who can come, explain, and be listened to. Even Einstein couldn't do that. And that leads to a second paradox that we should discuss, I think, in the framework of this afternoon. How are governments and public opinions, at least in countries where they carry weight, how are they led to accept, grudgingly, volens nolens, a large measure of independence for an activity that in many respects shapes society? You would think it might be a priority for them to control that activity. Well, laws of nature are what they are. And they are definitely not social constructs. And the ways, that is something, of course, which is rather difficult to understand when you are not taxed. The ways they are unveiled are largely endogenous. They don't answer to exogenous factors. Sometimes, but in general not. And they are often even random. I had the privilege, when I was a student in physics in Brussels, to be, in a certain sense, the factotum of Werner Heisenberg, probably the most important physicist with Einstein in the last century, when he was visiting Brussels. And he wouldn't have told me about the German atom bomb, of course, but he told me about how he came to the first coherent exposition of quantum mechanics. And the feeling he had that he was in a tunnel with rather little lights and with a map which was the kind of mathematical tool he had chosen as a way to express the theory he was looking for. Randomness played a role, along genius, of course. So, the very characteristics of scientific activity at its most significant scale level makes it difficult to control it. There have been governments who tried. For example, during the 30s, the German government was after a national socialist physics. I don't invent the expression. And the Soviets were after Soviet laws of biological evolution. But the results have been counterproductive, to say the least. But science is not pure speculation, is not discovering fundamentals. There are applications. And there are applications on a huge scale. For example, about 30% of the US GNP proceeds from applications of that most abstract physical theory, quantum mechanics. The transistor, the laser, nanophysics, and so on. All that is quantum mechanics. Nobody had seen that when quantum mechanics was created. But a huge world of applications was opened. And as soon as you are in the world of applications, without being too rigorous between fundamental and applications, of course, but there are differences. The border is not clear, but there are important differences. As soon as you are in the realm of applications which have, I've forgotten the computing, with applications which have so far-reaching consequences on social, economic, political life, you need control. And the characteristics at the first stage are no less so compelling. There are no less such obstacles against control. And here we have the third element I want to stress. Governments and economic forces have a manifest propensity to meddle with science, with basic science, which is inefficient. We have seen maybe dangerous. But they have a far greater propensity to keep democracy at bay when new applications are concerned. And as a result, you also have inefficient decisions. Meddling where you shouldn't, and censoring democratic control when it would be needed. That's about it. What is it? If I summarize this third point, I would say that there is something worse than bureaucratic meddling in fundamental science, and it is the reckless activism displayed behind closed doors by coalitions of scientists, politicians, and economic interests. They are prepared to accept anything which seems to be attractive from a political or financial point of view. Remember asbestos. We shouldn't have, I think everybody wouldn't like to have an asbestos saga at the 10th pore with nanoparticles. If you want to avoid that, don't expect that governments are, however responsible they are, business, however long far-reaching they see will provide the necessary controls and will contribute in a meaningful way to separate what might be a great benefit and what might be a great danger. Again, I use the example of nanoparticles. Today, almost 700 products containing nanoparticles are sold on markets without any regulatory control. Some of them are obviously dangerous for reasons which you can understand without being a PhD in physics. For example, the creams which contain them to be more effective against the sun, well, you put them on your skin. The skin is the door to the body. And so you have a natural way for what you should avoid at all costs, the introduction of these so tiny particles in your body, maybe in your brain. I'm not inventing it. I'm serious. Nobody is there to say that should be avoided. Other uses should be promoted. For example, if you go to MIT and you go to the School of Engineering, there is a lab there where they prepare what is called in technical language ultracapacitors, and it's physical batteries. You know that a battery is something which works on chemistry. You have a chemical reaction and you have a reverse chemical reaction when you charge and discharge the battery. It's not very efficient and it takes a long time. Charge, it's a matter of hours. With these new physical batteries, physical in the sense that they don't involve chemistry, you stock incredible numbers of electrons in nanotubes. One of the molecule of nanophysics which has been discovered by Richard Marley, with whom I quoted before, whose name I quoted before. These nanotubes have electrical and mechanical properties which are unimaginable in our world, in the large world. For example, you can stock 10 times more electrons in the same volume with these devices. They are the batteries of the future, maybe 7, 8 years. They would solve many problems. In particular, they could be recharged in 3 minutes. You would go to an electrical pump instead of diesel or petrol pump, and you would recharge the battery in 3 minutes. That would completely change the economics of the electric car, and so the economics of transport, in a sense which would be positive for sustainable development. So, the best or the worst. But while promoting the best, you should, in a certain sense, have a way to contain the worst. These bodies, where you have very competent scientists, where you have very responsible representatives of public authorities, where you have brilliant businessmen, they are completely unable, structurally unable, both because of what they know or they don't know, and because of the aims that we have, they are structurally unable to separate the worst from the best. And if you don't do that, one day, as with asbestos, the best might be sunk because of the worst and of the bad way you would have dealt with the worst. So the absolute necessity of regulatory control and of the democratic control, so that institutions which are not embedded in the choice as they are made could take the topics, express their views, and have an influence on how the applications of science are managed. Governments and public opinions generally have no deep understanding of science. And I have mentioned a few reasons why it is so. I have also, at least with my students, hinted to the possibility of correct that. So they have no deep understanding of science. But they tend to have simple ideas. And prominent among these ideas is science brings you certainty. This is indeed true in many respects. For example, the Galileo-Newton gravitation model gives you absolute certainty on the fact that you will stay on the ground in the zone. And even the quantum mechanics brings you certainty if you understand certainty in a slightly more general way, statistical certainty. When in a collider like in Geneva, neutrons hit nuclei and provoke the explosion of the nuclei, of course, you cannot say which particle produced by that effect will go which way and at which speed. But statistically, quantum mechanics gives you a perfectly accurate prediction of what will happen. That has been checked in experiment after experiment. And statistical certainty is, in general, in many important cases, it is just what you need to be able to go farther and to build experiments and to devise applications. Statistical uncertainty is much closer to certainty than it is to fundamental uncertainty. If you go to climatology, geochemistry, ecology, medicine, you have you have at least areas which are highly uncertain. And uncertain without statistical way to go around that uncertainty. You have no objective probability distribution to say things about the evolution of the climate or what happens in the body. You are here in very complex context. You have no clear-cut causality chains. And as I said, you have not even objective probability distribution to predict in a statistical way what will happen. So you face fundamental uncertainty as regards ecosystems, climate, medicine. That is, in fields where you would very much like to have a more reliable information and more reliable indications of what you should do. Does that mean that science is important when it is most needed? I will finish with I will introduce my fourth paradox, the paradox of a reliable and certain science, which at first glance seems, of course, the maximum. Not having science when most needed to illuminate the decisions you have made. The British have known that first time. In 1986, a new disease spread among British cows. Scientifically, it is called bovine spongiform encephalopathy, BSE, medical disease. The disease spread at an astonishing pace. But according to the British government at the end of the 80s, British beef is safe because there is a barrier of species, which means that that disease in cows cannot spread to other species, especially to human beings. That was an interesting example of bad science. That concept was more or less valid with other ailments, but without any theoretical foundation, and of course, in the case of medical disease, with no experimental foundation, empirical foundation, by definition of a new disease. But it was, in a certain sense, the anchor in such a difficult situation that the British authorities just seized. They seized it till 1991. Because in 1991, two biochemists in Bristol inoculated the disease to a cat. And as you know, that's something which is very well known about science. As soon as you have a counter example, the law is destroyed. So, the British government remained without any scientific foundation to illuminate its policy. And its policy, having a relevant policy was, in 91, even more urgent, because a new disease spread among young people, which has never been observed among young people, only old people. A new variant of a Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, which destroys your brain. So, what was it possible that new disease on young people might come from the new disease in cows? If it was the case, it was the case, it was clear that British beef should be banned immediately. Nobody could, I would say, construct a scientific case for or against such a decision. Well, to a certain extent, somebody could. Completely haphazard. It happened that, at the same time, a biochemist and doctor at UCLA, his name is Stanley Prusiner. Probably you don't know his name. He is one of the prominent biologists of 19th century, of the 18th century. He was looking after brain degenerative illnesses in mice. And he had the beginning of a theory and the beginning of a convincing set of empirical results. Most importantly, he had been able to identify the culprit. Most unexpected. A protein that had mutated, and under its mutated form and transform into a powerful agent of the degenerative process that started in the days of Marx. That was completely unorthodox biology. And I take the opportunity here to insist on the necessity in science to be prepared to completely unorthodox changes in the way you see the bigger world. Never has been a protein observed to transform into a pathogen. He had a few of the biochemical liaison events in the chain going from perfect ion to a pathogen. He had one of the steps. And he had good but limited data. That was clearly uncertain science. Was it reliable uncertain science? Reliable for the British government to decide ban, and for European authorities to decide to ban the beef in the Union? Incomplete, limited, but coherent. And in a certain sense, the only possible explanation to the spread from cow. The British government, the authorities of the European Union decided that indeed it was reliable, even if uncertain information, on which to base a decision, and the decision was to ban the disease. Public and indeed private decisions and policies will more and more have to be made in context of uncertain environments, uncertain contexts. We are confronted with decisions which have to be taken with regard to natural and human-made phenomena which are of such a complexity that you could never hope for certain science. It is then of the greatest importance to be able to say whether, when available information is reliable. If you refuse to do that, if, like President Bush, you ask for sound science, that is certain science, in contexts where you cannot get that, and you couldn't get that in the context of climate change, well, you give up. You throw all the information you have on which you might take a better decision. That information, the bulk of that information, will be more or less well established according to the canons of the lab. But you don't do that. You can refine it, you can improve it, you can get it less uncertain. But here, there is a barrier between the uncertainty which is characteristic of these complex contexts and something. Significant progress has been made on both the political level, decision-making level, and the theoretical level in assessing the reliability of uncertain science. And I would like to conclude that, however difficult to grasp this point, this concept of reliable and certain information should not be missed by decision makers and by the people, because the people, as I stressed, should be taught anything which regards education and science. Thank you. Now I have, of course, skipped a lot, a great number of points which are relevant for science and decision making. For example, patent to a university professor, a secret which might constraint on knowledge which might result, and then the negative effect on research to come, knowing that at the same time, in many situations, patents are required to make the process of application more efficient. It can be, again, the worst and the best thing. And again, it is up to public decision makers, to lawyers, to know where to put the borders between a reasonable patent system and a patent system, as is the case now in the United States and some other places as well, which is a machine to deter, no longer to promote innovation. That's a point which also should be discussed. And also, we should discuss points of deontology. Scientists are free to do many things. They are not free to break some fundamental rules. And when they break these rules, can be very harmful, not only for them, but also for the lab where they work, and for the country, and for science in general. That's another question which should be asked. I stop, and I hope that you might like to discuss and raise some of these things. Especially if you think that that's simple.
Professor Lee, will you comment a little bit on the issue of ethics? I mean, you talked earlier about nanotechnology, for example, applications that are regulated, and there are even more, maybe more worrisome areas: biotechnology, cloning, child selection, genetic selection. How is our current architecture for ethics globally, ethics and scientific innovation, and what can be done to improve both the discourse and the structure of coming up with the right ethics to deal with scientific advances? Thank you.
There is, of course, a question of ethics which is rather simple to deal with, and that is ethics at the level of the lab, the level of research. It is, for example, refrain from manipulating the data, refrain from fraud. Sometimes it happens. Due to the process, due to the intense competition between scientists, is in general quickly. I don't know. It's very shocking when it happens. It is a question of scientific honor. Okay. I don't think it was more difficult to detect in the 19th century. Now, there might be a question of ethics at the level of what you want to know about nature and the one you want to refrain from. It was in part a question of ethics, in a certain sense, that led Galileo to his triplet. In most cases, it's ethics badly used. But if you want to know more about certain basic biological processes, if you think that the knowledge will almost certainly lead to applications that you consider as unethical. It's very difficult. But at the level of society, it's a question worth asking. Having in mind that scientific knowledge is a public good, that means that as soon as you have it, everybody has it. So, to a certain sense, if a piece of knowledge is censored somewhere, even for very good reasons, it will help. Now we come to the level where it is really significant and we can do something. The level of application. Certainly, we have very good reasons and some toxicological studies, especially in the United States, Texas, for example, at MIT, lead us to think that in certain applications, nanoparticles can be extremely dangerous. And so we should regulate. And regulation can go to a level of public certain. We, as you said, we have perspectives which are even more frightening, less frightening. A colleague, I think it's Indiana, has written a book. He's a lawyer specializing in biological applications, has written a book about enhancing human species. And he shows, well, he has a scenario. In a certain sense, it's science fiction, but in another sense, it's very convincing if you don't have blocks to stop at certain points. A society of inequality enhanced, or competition between nations in enhancing. Well, it's science fiction. It's science fiction in the sense that we don't know yet how to fight, for example, Alzheimer. We know the ways, but we have not tried so. And we know even less that whether we could, if we succeeded with Alzheimer, we could use the same drugs to enhance. It might become difficult. So it's science fiction. But it looks some credibility. And it's clear that very, very broad ethic and political problems are raised by such perspective. Compared with nanoparticles, nanoparticles compared with that is slowly of the state. If I may summarize in just one sentence, we are able to manipulate both matter and life at the most intimate level. We are able to pick one atom and put it in another place. We are able to make almost anything with a gene that we want to introduce in another body or for the best. It's when you have a plant, you have a white plant, it is resistant against drought. You take the gene, which commands electricity. You put it in a bacteria. That's the wide garden technology. And then that bacterium is well chosen. You put it in rice. And you get a rice which will be resistant. Fantastic. Yes. But do that with human beings. And we have no body of ethics, and even less body of politics to be prepared. So maybe a little more knowledge of science might even be sent to build these bodies of ethics. So,
yes, Professor, I wonder what your advice would be on some controversial science policies, such as GMO technology as applied to plant farming, for example, cotton, you mentioned rice, soybean, and this kind of important human, obviously it's very essential, especially to developing countries like large nations like China. China, of course, right, and China has been watching European countries, which has much restrictive policy, say also in the United States, which is less restrictive on GMOs. So I wonder, and then of course China has recently declared there's quite a success in cotton GMO because it's, against, it's really reduced the use of pesticides and increased production. So what would your argument, I know that obviously it's worldwide, there's no consensus yet, even among scientists there's no consensus yet. For this kind of controversial science breakthroughs, what would the government policy would be? Should they consider their own countries in a condition that say, well, we need to produce more and use less pesticides, so even though we know that maybe in long term, or it's still controversial, so should they adopt this policy or not?
I first give an answer, try to give an answer as an economist. For a long time, GMOs were, apart from China. But in the rest of the world, GMOs were a kind of monopoly of Monsanto. And the farms who are depending on Monsanto for the licenses. And why is it so? Just if you come back to the rice example, you understand. You need to take a gene from a plant, introduce in a bacteria that's inert, and then introduce a bacteria in another. The first step is in the public domain. It's a technique by going. The second step was a monopoly. Because in the US system of patents, you may patent a gene. You may patent almost a law of nature. But you may patent almost anything. And when you patent a gene, you have the property of all what you can do with that. Not only what the applications you have asked for the patent, any application that nobody has thought of at the time of the patent being granted. So the monopoly of Monsanto was based upon a patent which was very close. The great economist Schumpeter has advocated the use of patents as an incentive for inventors. But, and that is very, very important, he also said in the same book, patent the invention, don't patent the science which is wrong. And above all, of course, don't patent elements of life or basic matter. That's as important. And that has created that. And what does a monopoly? Of course, a monopoly might raise prices. As long as it isn't, what it is. But that's not the main negative effect of a monopoly. A monopoly chooses some activities that it can realize with its monopoly power. and chooses to exclude every other agent from the other. It's not the law of nature, but it's often observed. Monsanto was very interested in making gene transformation which helped selling its product. It was not interested in changing the characteristic or price of its product. So in that sense, I was, with many people, very much against what Monsanto proposed to our countries in Europe. You are not dependent. There are also problems with certain of the GMOs, there are problems of the environment. There are genetically modified plants which we know now have a great propensity to pollute, to change the characteristics of other plants to which they give their modified gene. That can be important in certain environments. That is important with some plants, not in all environments, not with all plants. In 1905, Nature published a paper by a bunch of Belgian and Australian biologists and worked together. And what they had to report was for the economist revolution. They reported that they had identified quite a family of bacteria, completely different from the bacteria used by Monsanto and thus not covered by even world Monsanto patent. And these bacteria could do the job. You might say it's not terribly interesting to transform a monopoly into a duopoly. But we know theoretically and practically that pollution in such a situation. But it didn't take it out. They protected their invention like the free software. It's protection. But it allows you to use it without having to pay anything, but if you improve the technology, you have to put it again into public domain. That's the point. That changes completely the economics of the thing. And that gives the possibility of developing countries to use it freely for what is important. The GMOs in Europe or the United States, not important. They're important because I suppose I won't go to the case to highly more efficient production of cotton, and when it comes to producing food in conditions where it was impossible, salted or raw, for example.
I have a question on science policy, and I wonder whether we can benefit from your wisdom. In developing countries of the middle range, not enormous countries, but of the middle range, middle level in income and size and so on, the question often arises in terms of funding research and funding scientific research. On the one hand, there's an argument, well, we need more, and a greater proportion of the public budget ought to be allocated to research and to basic research. And some people say, well, in developing countries, and particularly in the smaller or middle-sized countries, there isn't enough critical mass to really make any great breakthroughs. So it is a mistake to invest in basic science. Rather, the money should go towards applied research, because that's where the benefit will come from. And the debate is still open, but I would be interested in your views on it.
First, would avoid I will avoid the question because I will try to answer for China, for Brazil, for India and a bunch of other countries like that. And I know, I experience, not in China, I have no experience of these research centers in China. But in Brazil, for example, you have the Getúlio Vargas Foundation in Rio, which pays for a research center, including mathematics, which has been considered as out of proportion at one time with the development. But it's no longer out of proportion, and more importantly, it proved important for development, industrial, agricultural development of the country. That center is also a center in Curitiba in the south of Brazil. Why? For the fundamental reason which I tried to explain, you might have heard of the physicist Enrico Fermi. Enrico Fermi was in Italy. He left Italy to not to be under the power of Mussolini. He went to the States. And in the States, he was a man who wrote the letter that Einstein sent to President Roosevelt about the danger, about the existence and the danger of the Germans getting an atomic bomb. A good example of pedagogy. With that, no problem to understand that. It started immediately at Columbia. Well, just to show the importance of Enrico Fermi, that it's more as a scientist, working scientist, that he is absolutely important. In the paper, I give the quotation from him, and that quotation is about the day when he discovered the reaction, the effect, which is the basis of the functioning of any nuclear reactor. He was studying neutrons hitting nuclei, and just was experimenting physics, and just looking at that. And what they got, he says, were absolutely an incomplete result. Made no sense. Couldn't be explained by the theory they were bringing. And in that case, it was not the theory which was wrong, it was the conditions of the experiment that were wrong. And before I should put something to block part of the beam and have less neutrons going because it's so carried. And of course, he thought of lead, which was the obvious choice. And at the last moment, it's his story. At the last moment, he didn't pick the lead, he picked a block of plexiglass. And he didn't know why, exactly he didn't know why, but in his brain, something new, but he didn't know why. So that the neutrons were not so much blocked as by a piece of lead. They were just, they lost. And the reaction he got at the end was incredibly amplified. He had discovered that to have a nuclear reaction, you have neutrons which should not travel at high speeds. Now, was it just like that? Was it, as he done what Einstein said that God didn't do, tossing reality? No. After that he analyzed it, and he discovered that all the physics which he had in his brain, the latent in his brain, naturally conducted him that choice. And the people who worked with him when they built the first reactor in the Chicago basement, the basement of the University of Chicago, they noticed again and again that he could have incredible shortcuts which, without explanation, resolve technical problems. And that was just that he had so much he had so much knowledge in his brain, and he was able, in a non-explicit way, to use that knowledge. Many good physicists or biologists function like that. And if you have not these people, you will never be able to use fundamental science coming from elsewhere to put them to carry that. Now, when you have small poor countries, well, of course, Pakistan is not small, not very rich, especially 25 years ago when Abdul Salam created his Center for Nuclear Physics, again, the best of the West. It was invested. It was also invested that the centers in Brazil very well performed. It's not possible for China or for even for Nigeria. That's not possible. And it's just one of the reasons why their situation is so different from the situation of the countries which are not. You might think of course, collaboration, pooling resources, and helping. Abdul Salam was determined after brilliant scientific career, Nobel Prize, and so on, to help his country. Probably not imagining how the help would be used. Suppose we are, you and I, biologists or physicists.
I wasn't thinking about the chat, nor of this, something in between. It's good in Chile as well.
Chile is good. Chile is even advanced in respect to Brazil. The Chilean universities in Santiago are a first-class center for teaching and research. Of course, they have benefited from help. The physics, for instance, we say that have been formed in Chicago, and the mathematicians have been formed in Paris. And they have been back, and the physicists, MIT, they came back like Abdul Salam, and they created teams and excellent environment for research and teaching, attracting Americans over the years. So it's not so much a question of size. Size is important, but not so much a question of size. Nigeria is huge. No hope. Well, there's no question.
A question about the patent system. My knowledge of patent system is that it's a monopoly for a limited period of time. Now the debate is how long should the monopoly be? So your position is patent system as a whole is no good. Because empirically, if we look at the world and we look at the level of scientific discoveries, and also you associate this variable with institutional arrangements such as patent system. Those countries with the sophisticated patent systems tend to drive more scientific discoveries. No?
You have a weak patent system, and it's better.
My understanding. The other aspect of patent system is if you patent something, you must make known whatever you have to the public, right? So in terms of spreading of knowledge, the element is already there.
I come back to these two gentlemen from Stanford and Berkeley, Albert Boyer and Stanley Cohen. Cohen in Stanford had the idea of this process of healing. And he had some technical results he realized. But he went to a conference in Hawaii and attended a presentation of colleagues. And one of these colleagues didn't know was Albert Boyer. From what he got when Boyer spoke, he understood that Boyer had the keys he needed. He could have gone back to his lab in Stanford and tried to build the keys by himself. He had the reaction of a normal scientist in such environment. I mean, normal before master degree. He went to Boyer and tried to have a pizza and discuss over pizza. And he just told him what he was yesterday. He said, I think you can. And Boyer was convinced, enthusiastic, and they started day and night working together, and after 4 months, they got it. And they started writing a paper. And then, that's what we wanted to do. But the university said, no, a lot of money to make the patent. You should patent. And the offices of patenting of both universities started together to write patent. And many was given. They accepted the principle of patenting, which they had in Portugal, and at the same time they set conditions. Licenses should be available to anybody who asks at a modest price. Well, modest compared with usual prices in such and that. Universities should get them free. And we will organize maximum review. That's good patenting. And they got a lot of money because, of course, it's sold huge money. But nobody in the profession, nobody in firms bought licenses, nobody in universities, was hindered in his efforts to develop applications, to develop, create techniques which were more sophisticated and so on. So it was made public, as you say, it was made largely available, and it was the basis for both, for a large degree. You should remark that it had no incentive value, because they did the work without knowing they would have. And they were so much rewarded without any money by being the people who did genetic engineering for the first time in history. You must assess the incentive of this business. Money, you are happy to money, not more money. It's not incentive. And you shouldn't treat the process of scientific production as if money was the main incentive. So, not very far from that, in Salt Lake City, a startup has been created, which is called Myriad Genetics. And they were offering tests for women who discover whether they had a high propensity to cancer breast. Where did that test come from? Well, the story is nice as well. A biochemist in Berkeley, really, 5 years before, discovered that one gene in the body of a woman increases in significant ways the propensity to develop breast cancer. She identified the gene. But Berkeley is not that rich, and she had not the machines, at that time very expensive, to sequence the gene, to observe, to know which sequence of DNA is in that gene. The information went through the electronics. They jumped on their sequence machines, which were very up-to-date. They sequenced easily, and they asked about on what? On the gene and all its applications and effects. They had waited some time because it's wrong. And during that time, a couple of biologists, biochemists in Cambridge, England, to discover another gene with the same effect. And of course, when you have both mutated, you have very high propensity to get breast cancer. They have no money. They published, maybe our genetics sequenced, asked for 7 patents, and eventually got 2 patents. Getting, well, it's not a very nice story of getting patents. That's not the main thing. The main thing is that they didn't use their patents as widely and use. They decided that they would sell no patents, that they would sell their tests at a very high monopoly price. And they went around the United States to the labs and the hospitals, and especially I know the case of the Pennsylvania hospital, and saying, you are working on that, you have patients which are under experiment, stop it immediately. You buy the test for cost. And Pennsylvania, it was especially dramatic because the doctor said, it's impossible, we have all these women here. We go on. And the lawyers of the university said, the cost of the university $300 million. Stop. And they stopped everywhere in the States. They went to Canada just to show you how it is important to be in a correct setting to make the correct use of the patent. They went to Canada and they told the same story. In Canada, the answer was, oh, you know, have you got a patent in Canada? No, you will not get it. So shut up. We don't know. And the Canadians developed their test at a fifth of the price. So they got it. And then they came to Europe. And they came to the European Patent Office. And they said, we got these patents in America. You should run them here in Europe as well. And the European Patent Office often, as a reaction, I would say, of a developed country, saying, if the Americans do that, we should do the same. Else we will be marginalized, we will be lower, and so on. So, we got it. But, and that just to finish the answer and to show how institutions are important. In Europe, at the European Patent Office, you have a branch which here oppositions. It doesn't exist in America. In America, if you are not happy with the patent, you go to the courts. And that is a very, very random and costly process. Then you go to that branch. if you have two arguments. And a consortium of cancer institutes from Paris, Brussels, Copenhagen, Germany, they made a case. And they were able to prove that, first, because of what happened in Berkeley and in Cambridge, the patents were invalid. Second, they had techniques which they had developed before the diagnosis to make tests. No fees, very low. Obligation for that branch to hear all the scientific objections. And of course, what my colleague Nicolas Jean-Tirole showed very well, a high incentive, of course, for all people who thought that the patent was invalid to go, which a controller, an inspector inside an office is not intends to accept anything. So, patent no reward. Wow. That's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. That's an extreme proposition. But if you have a patent system and you deal it in a way which provides both incentives and diffusion, fine. If you block diffusion, if you exploit a monopoly position, it should be fought. It's a summary. It's a very complicated issue. And I believe that in our world now, with all these innovations coming and all these complexities, the initial idea of Schumpeter is the good one. Patent the thing, don't patent the idea. That's what happened with software. And now it is mimicked in biology and even in electronics. Possibly it's also good to deal with detection and diffusion.
Follow-up question that has to do with the complaints about China, the intellectual property rights protection regime. What's your comment or the general direction we are going?
I have been told recently the case, I've been told by friends at Électricité de France, I've been told the case of turbines sold by General Electric and Alstom, which are the main providers of turbines for power plants. So they sold state-of-the-art turbine, maximum output that you can have. You can hope if you take into account the local and nuts. And well, it was commercial. They got a good price, as I've been told. And they took a second step. They gave for free the patents to Chinese enterprises, firms making turbines, with two ideas. The first is, anyway, they will commit it. So what is called, what is referred to as the weakness of the patent system in nature. Second, better give them the perfect model we have developed, rather than for them using imperfect imitations. And better for them having them as soon as possible to build their power plants with the most efficient turbines, which they will, and they will be able to build it at the pace which is required by the construction of power plants. We could, anyway. I think it's as far aside from General Electric and Alstom. But something which is more interesting is one incentive in that transaction, giving these patents, is the weakness of the Chinese system. In that sense, the weakness of the Chinese system turns out to be positive. Don't generalize. With nuclear equipment, you would be much more. Okay. You should share. What I can say also is that when the WTO was created, at the same time, a system of patents uniform for all countries, members of the WTO, was introduced. TRIPS. And one of the not reasons, but a way of justifying that uniform system, obviously comparing interests of developing countries. One of the justification was if there is a strict, terribly strict, not so general and goal-based as in the States, but very strict system of patent in these countries, they will attract more investment because the investing firms will not fear to see their property, their property stolen. Okay, which is the country which got the most investment? The country with the weakest patent system. And econometric studies shown that these countries who have been good pupils, who have obeyed the rules of the TRIPS system, there is no significant increase of investment, innovative investment. It was pure rhetoric. You get a lot of pure rhetoric. As far as the government is concerned. So that was a little long.
The last presentation, you provide potentially misleading because when you look at the aggregate data of investment, some investment come with the technologies, other come just in the form of capital, or there is no intellectual components of the investment. They just want to combine the capital with the labor.
It's only investment with innovative technology.
Okay.
The World Bank.
I had just a question for you. Because you talk about the apparatus we have to assess the reliability of uncertain science.
Sorry.
The apparatus that we have to assess the reliability of uncertain science. And you say in your paper that it has been greatly developed, so we have greater capacity of assessing the reliability of uncertain science. I was wondering if you could tell us more about this better ability in what it consists. And then the second part of the question, you deal with the way public policymakers make decisions on the basis of uncertain science, but often when they do make decisions, they do it in a situation of emergency or urgency, as you said in the British situation.
Not 10 years.
Okay. So the
ongoing emergency.
Yeah, so the question is it better to rely on uncertain science before the emergency, or is it better to wait as far as possible and act in an emergency situation when it doesn't?
When you need it, but as a general rule, don't delay difficult decisions. On the first part of your question, I give a reference in the paper, and it's easily reached because it's on the web. But I wouldn't avoid answering, and I would stress 2 points. The first one is that being aware of that, scientists, at least in climatology and in ecology, make an effort to qualify the uncertainties in their knowledge and in the hazards of their knowledge. And in particular, to clearly separate what they consider as reasonably certain and what they consider as speculative, i.e. uncertain. That's first. That's very important. That's very clear when you compare the successive reports of the IPCC. And the second answer, to answer, I know somebody who might answer in a better way, and I go back to my paper. Well, it's not there. No, I didn't put it in the paper. It's a British physicist, Zeeman, not to be confused with mathematician, and he has become a kind of historian of science and a bit of philosopher of science, and he considered that question 10 years ago. And he said that to assess the reliability of some scientific result, you must consider basically 2 series of factors. One is, of course, the relevance, the soundness of the methodology used, and also the effort that the authors have made to clearly indicate the bounds of relevance of their results. That's basic. And the second is you should also look in which framework that science has been used. If you are Charles Towns inventing the principle and the machine, the laser, and working with a few students in his lab, you don't need a great frame, a great environment. If you are doing climate knowledge, that's very connected. It's produced by a network of people and of labs which are connected with each other, which cooperate, which at the same time are in competition, and so on and so on. And, very important, which check each other. Be careful with the way, the social way, the organizational way that science has been used. That's relevant for these big endeavors. It's not relevant for something which is more classical. But the way science is produced is as important as the methods which have been used to assess the validity of results. It's not perfect. There could be, how can I say that? A belle cochon, a big effect, when all the people around Kennedy were convincing each other that it would be very easy to do it, and to have the upper hand. So you can have that in such networks. So it's also important that some good specialists remain outside and can have a look, independent look on that. It has another problem, underestimation. And that is the direct result of the honesty of the scientists. When I meet the president of the IPCC. I'm always struck by the fact that you would say, in our last report, in our last releases, we couldn't take into account such and such effect because it was too uncertain. It was not sufficiently established. Nowadays, and in general, doesn't go in the good sense. The Arctic is melting faster, some currents are weakening. We didn't have enough science about that before. So we didn't introduce. So we didn't give the information, however uncertain, to the decision makers. Because we had to stick to scientific rules, which is at the same time absolutely necessary and in a certain sense misleading. And you heard probably of the Stern review about the economics of climate. When I discussed with them, it comes at 71. I was too optimistic. And not being sure couldn't be too pessimistic. It wouldn't have been accepted. But after that, getting the information, I realized that he was too optimistic. And again, in this case, it could go in the other direction. In this case, always go in the same direction. And it is, to a certain extent, the product of the honesty of science. You are in the conclusion. There is nobody here to say that it's over.